I knew something wasn't right when I first heard my father's voice on the phone. It wasn't just that his tone was harsh. He stated that we should be straightforward and completely free of the customary politeness. Your brother will also be attending tomorrow's family meeting. I tightened my hold on my phone as my stomach turned. Years had passed since I last saw my brother, the man who had betrayed me by stealing my wife. I had learned to live with a scar that never really healed. I immersed myself in my job, piecing my life back together. I persuaded myself that I had moved on, that I no longer cared about what they had done. But despite what my father had told me, he was back. There was a brief period of stillness as the weight of his words settled over me. My father didn't call to ask if I wanted to attend. This wasn't a request, it was a summons. I hesitated. My thoughts screamed at me to refuse, to come up with an excuse, but I knew in my heart that I couldn't evade them forever. If my father was calling this meeting, it had to be significant. I exhaled slowly and squeezed out a simple reply. I'll be there. That evening, as I pulled up to my father's house, memories flooded my mind. The driveway, where I once stood with my wife, hugging her tight, where I had laughed with my brother about foolish things. The same driveway where, 4 years ago, I had slammed the front door shut behind me, swearing never to look back. Yet here I was, going through it all again. The familiar scent of my father's cigars hung in the air, mingling with something deeper. My heart pounded harder than I cared to admit. Even though my mother had been gone for years, traces of her still lingered, the faintest hint of lavender perfume. Some things had remained the same, but some things had changed. Because as I stepped inside, I saw them, seated together in the living room, pretending nothing had ever happened. My brother was relaxed in his chair, one arm carelessly slung over the side. He still exuded the same cockiness that had always defined him, well-groomed, hair perfectly styled, a more expensive watch than some people's rent, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, and sitting beside him was her. When my ex-wife saw me, she gave me a pleased, comfortable smile, the kind a cat gives to a mouse. She wasn't afraid. She looked me up and down, grinning, as if she were seeing an old acquaintance rather than the husband she had betrayed. My brother scoffed, tilting his head. "Still ugly, I see." His words dripped with mockery, and my fingers twitched. A sharp, primal part of me wanted to lunge across the room and wipe that arrogant smirk off his face, but I forced myself to stay still. Then she chuckled, soft, mean, clenched my jaw. I had prepared myself for this moment for years, convinced that I wouldn't let them drag me back into their petty taunts. But as I stood there now, hearing their voices, seeing their faces, I realized something. No. Before I could speak, my father rose from his seat and the room fell silent. He had always been a man of authority, one who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. "Good timing," he said, his sharp gaze shifting from my brother to me. His voice was calm, but beneath it lay something firm, final. My brother sneered, and my ex-wife shifted slightly in her seat. They weren't prepared for this. My father walked to his desk and pulled out a thick envelope, setting it down with deliberate care. "This is my will." The air in the room changed. A crushing weight pressed down on all of us. My brother's smirk vanished. My ex-wife stiffened. For the first time since I had entered the house, she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at that envelope. "So, we're talking about this now?" my brother asked, his voice quieter than usual. My father's expression didn't waver. "I don't have time to waste words." The silence was suffocating. Then, his words dropped like a hammer. "I have terminal cancer. 3 months to live." The room froze. My brother's back snapped straight. His wife's hand shot to her lips, her eyes widening, not with sorrow, but calculation. Shock gripped my chest. I had suspected something was wrong, but hearing it out loud, my father looked thinner, his voice heavier, his clothes a little looser. And in that moment, all the bitterness, all the betrayal, all the past, it didn't matter. For the first time in 4 years, I wasn't thinking about myself. I was thinking about my father and the time he had left. I stole a glance at my brother. His face was unreadable, but I knew him well enough to catch the small tells, the tightening of his jaw, the twitch of his fingers. He was calculating. Beside him, my ex-wife sat rigid, her eyes darting between my father and the envelope. She wasn't thinking about the man who had once provided for her. She was thinking about what this meant for them. I shouldn't have been surprised. My brother had always been the one concerned with inheritance, status, power. The golden child, charming, ambitious, successful. He had taken everything from me once before, my wife, my home, my future. But now, I could see something new in his eyes. Panic. I had spent years convincing myself that karma didn't exist, that people like them always got away with their sins. But as I sat there, I saw the cracks forming, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I thought I had lost forever. Satisfaction. My father leaned back in his chair, his gaze locked on my brother. Then, he calmly pulled another envelope from his desk. "Let's talk about something important." He set it down. "Some of you seem to think you're entitled to things you don't deserve." My brother swallowed. My ex-wife's smirk was long gone. And at that moment, I knew everything was about to change. "Give it to him." He turned to face me, his eyes flaming, his face twisted with anger. "He doesn't deserve it." I cocked my head and replied, "I didn't take it from you first." His wife shook her head, her well-maintained mouth tightening. She snapped, losing her temper. "So we got a lawyer. You're welcome." My father interrupted, his voice unwavering. "Try all you want, but you won't succeed." I sat quietly, feeling a deep satisfaction. This was the empire. This time there was nothing my brother could do to stop the collapse of the fortune he had built on falsehoods. "Stop it!" I reclined in my chair, watching as panic took hold of them. For years I believed I would never get justice, that they would rob me of everything and walk away unscathed. But now, the tables had turned. For the first time, I was free. My brother stood frozen, his father's words weighing down on him. His wife clutched his arm so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "This isn't real," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But it was. "Dad, you can't be serious." My brother's voice cracked with desperation. "You're going to throw me away? Your own son?" My father exhaled, rubbing his brow. For the first time, he looked tired, but his voice remained firm. "The moment you chose to violate this, you threw yourself away." My brother shook his head. "No, this isn't right." He turned to me, his eyes burning with bitterness. "You think you deserve this?" His voice was sharp and accusing. "You're nothing. You've never been anything. Dad is just punishing me because I—" His wife finally met his gaze, her expression cold. "If that helps you sleep at night," she snapped, slamming her hands on the table. "You thought you could take everything from us, and we'd just walk away." My father's eyes hardened. My brother had always lived in luxury, always receiving gifts without lifting a finger. Now, for the first time, he had no way out. "I swear to God, this isn't finished." His voice shook with rage. My father nodded, completely unconcerned. "So fight it. Waste what little money you have left on lawyers who will tell you exactly what I did." His wife's breath hitched. My brother's fists clenched, his knuckles white. They had made their living by stealing from me, from my mother, from my father. Now they had nothing left. Then my father stood, his presence commanding the room. He pulled out a second document and placed it on the table. "These are copies. Of financial transactions proving you stole from me. My brother didn't move. He barely breathed. My father continued, his voice calm but certain. If you fight this, I will take these to the authorities, and you will pay for what you did for the rest of your life. His wife gasped, her face drained of color. She turned to my brother, gripping his arm. Tell me he's lying. But my brother said nothing. He couldn't. My father leaned forward slightly. You have a choice. Leave now or fight me and lose everything. The air was thick with the unspoken threat. My brother sagged, realization settling in. He had lost. He turned to his wife. We'll take legal action, he yelled, but his voice was hollow. She flinched, her eyes widening. Shut up, she snapped. My father shook his head and exhaled. Another word, and you're done. My brother pushed away from the table and stood. He moved slowly, as if he had aged 10 years in minutes. His wife's chest rose and fell rapidly, her eyes filled with disbelief. You're a joke, she spat. You're just going to accept this? My brother didn't argue. He knew. This was it. My father took a sip of water and gestured toward the door. Now go. My brother clenched his jaw, trembling with rage. But instead of fighting, he turned and left. His wife didn't follow. I exhaled slowly, watching them walk away. For years I had been burdened by their betrayal, convinced that justice didn't exist. But now, I stood tall. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like the final nail in a coffin. As I sat in the empty space they left behind, I realized something. I wasn't just free of them. I was free of the weight they had placed on me. I turned to my father. He was still sitting, his fingers tapping quietly on the chair's armrest. His posture remained firm, but his expression was unreadable. You did well, he said. I shook my head. I didn't do anything. You didn't have to, he replied. For the first time, I looked back at the door, replaying the moment in my head. My brother, once the golden child, had finally fallen. His world was collapsing, and I had no intention of stopping it. The fallout. Begins within a week, the fractures started. First, the money, or rather, the lack of it. Without my father's support, my brother struggled. The mansion, the cars, the extravagant lifestyle, all built on handouts, not hard work. 3 days after, the money ran out. He called me. I let it ring. By the 4th day, he sent a message. We need to talk. I deleted it.